I was always getting ready. Not for something specific. Just, ready. Ready for the moment when life would finally begin. When things would be stable enough, clear enough, safe enough for me to step fully into myself. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I believed preparation was wisdom. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for most of my life. I didn't waste my life being reckless. I wasted it being prepared. From the outside, my choices looked sensible. I planned ahead. I delayed gratification. I invested in the future. I said no to things that felt premature, risky, or emotionally inconvenient. I told myself I was being patient. Everyone praised that. He's smart. He thinks long-term. He knows what he's doing. I believed them. I structured my life around readiness. I wasn't unhappy, I was cautious. I wasn't lost, I was waiting. Every desire was placed on hold, every impulse postponed until it could be justified by timing, logic, or security. I told myself I'd live fully later. Later became my favorite word. Later, when I'm more settled. Later, when things calm down. Later, when I have more clarity. Later never felt like avoidance. It felt responsible. What I didn't notice was how thin my present became. I moved through days like checkpoints. Tasks completed. Boxes ticked. Progress measured. I didn't linger. Lingering felt unproductive. Dangerous, even. As if enjoying the moment might distract me from preparing for what came next. I treated my life like a rehearsal. Not badly, just cautiously. Relationships were handled the same way. I kept things measured. I didn't attach too deeply. I avoided emotional intensity that might complicate my plans. I told myself commitment required stability, and stability required time. People came and went. I stayed polite. I stayed reasonable. I stayed distant enough to remain in control. I wasn't afraid of love. I was afraid of choosing it before I was ready. I remember moments that should have stopped me, small, human moments where life quietly invited me in. A conversation that lingered. A chance that felt alive. A version of myself that surfaced unexpectedly and asked to be taken seriously. I acknowledged those moments. And postponed them. I told myself I was protecting my future. I didn't realize I was starving my present. Years passed without drama. Nothing collapsed. Nothing forced my hand. That was part of the problem. When life doesn't punish your delay, you start believing it approves of it. I became very good at waiting. Waiting felt active. Purposeful. Like I was building towards something important. But waiting is only meaningful if it ends. Mine didn't. I noticed the shift slowly. Days started feeling interchangeable. Memories blurred together. I struggled to recall when something had last truly mattered to me emotionally, not logically. I wasn't unhappy. That made everything harder. Because unhappiness gives you permission to change. I had no permission. Just a vague sense that I was missing something, and no justification to go looking for it. I told myself this was adulthood. That intensity fades. That preparation replaces spontaneity. That the people who live in the moment eventually regret it. I felt superior to them. Quietly. But late at night, when no one was watching, I felt an unease I couldn't name. A sense that I was always arriving just after something important had happened. I was present everywhere. But never fully there. The first time the realization hit me clearly, it wasn't dramatic. I was doing something ordinary, something I had done countless times before, and suddenly I felt a wave of panic. Not fear of failure. Fear of emptiness. I looked at my life and realized I could explain every decision. I just couldn't feel them. Everything made sense. Almost nothing felt alive. That's when the thought surfaced, quiet but unmistakable. What if this is already my life? Not a preparation. Not a warm-up. What if this careful, postponed existence, is the main event? The thought unsettled me deeply. Because I had no memory of choosing it consciously. I had drifted into it by always choosing later. I began to see how often I had postponed joy because it felt premature. How often I had delayed honesty because it felt inconvenient. How often I had told myself, not yet, until the desire itself learned to stay quiet. I hadn't failed to live. I had deferred living. And time, I was starting to realize, doesn't pause while you prepare. It moves on. Silently. I didn't know yet how much time I had lost. Or whether anything could still be reclaimed. I only knew that something essential had been waiting for me, and I had never shown up. Once that thought settled in, what if this is already my life, preparation stopped feeling safe. It started feeling like a delay tactic I had been using against myself. I began to notice time differently. Not as something ahead of me, but as something slipping past quietly, without asking for permission. Weeks folded into months. Months into years. And nothing marked them except progress reports and plans for what came next. I realized I had very few memories that felt vivid. Plenty of events, yes. Meetings. Moves. Milestones. But almost none of them carried emotional weight. They were logged, not lived. Like entries in a calendar rather than experiences in a body. That scared me. I started looking back at moments where life had offered me something real, not dramatic opportunities, just honest ones. A relationship that wanted commitment before everything was perfect. A chance to choose presence over preparation. A version of myself that wanted to stop waiting and start existing. I had declined them all politely. Not because they were wrong. Because they were early. Too early to risk comfort. Too early to abandon planning. Too early to commit without guarantees. I told myself I was being patient. But patience is only a virtue when it serves something real. Mine served fear. I tried to fix the problem the only way I knew how. I prepared harder. I optimized my routine. I set clearer goals. I told myself that if I could just reach the next stage, more stability, more clarity, more certainty, the sense of life would finally arrive. It didn't. Instead, the unease sharpened. I felt increasingly disconnected during moments that should have mattered. Celebrations felt hollow. Achievements landed without impact. I smiled, thanked people, moved on, and felt nothing afterward. I wasn't depressed. I was postponed. The fear grew when I realized how easily I could imagine the future, and how empty that image felt. More of the same, refined. More preparation. More waiting. A longer runway and no takeoff. I began to understand something terrifying. Readiness is not a destination. It's a story we tell ourselves to avoid choosing. There is no moment when life officially announces that you're prepared enough to live it. No internal signal that says now you may begin. That signal is a myth invented by people who are afraid of irreversible steps. And I was terrified of those. Because irreversible steps mean loss. They mean choosing one thing and letting others disappear. They mean accepting that you cannot rewind and start again with better information. Preparation keeps all doors open. Life requires you to close some. I started feeling grief for things that hadn't even happened, not because they failed, but because they expired quietly while I waited. Relationships that faded without conflict. Passions that dulled without resistance. Versions of myself that never fully formed because they were never claimed. That grief didn't come with tears. It came with heaviness. A weight that settled into my chest and made everything feel late. I caught myself thinking, should have done this earlier, and immediately correcting it, no, I wasn't ready then. But the correction sounded hollow. Because I realized something painful. I was never going to feel ready. Ready wasn't a state I was approaching. It was a barrier I kept raising. The more I prepared, the more prepared I felt I needed to be. The horizon kept moving. Safety demanded more safety. Certainty demanded more certainty. And life waited for nothing. I began to notice people around me who hadn't waited. Not reckless people. Not irresponsible ones. Just people who had chosen at some point to stop preparing and start participating. Their lives weren't perfect. But they were textured. They had stories that mattered to them. Losses that shaped them. choices that anchored them. They didn't talk about life like a plan. They talked about it like something that had happened to them. I envied that more than success. One evening, alone, I sat with the realization I had been avoiding. If I keep preparing, I will wake up one day fully ready, and completely out of time. That thought didn't panic me. It sobered me. Preparation had given me control. But it had taken away urgency. And without urgency, nothing truly begins. I felt myself approaching a threshold I could no longer step around. A point where I would have to choose between staying prepared forever or risking being unprepared, and finally alive. I didn't know yet which way I would go. I only knew that preparation had stopped protecting me. It was now the thing I needed protection from. The moment I stopped preparing didn't feel like courage. It felt like surrender. Not to life, to time. I realized I was tired of arguing with the present. Tired of negotiating with myself about when I would finally be allowed to live. Tired of telling my own desires to wait in line behind plans that never ended. There was no dramatic decision. No clean break. Just a quiet understanding that if I kept waiting for readiness, would never arrive anywhere that mattered. So I did something that felt deeply irresponsible to the version of me I had been. I chose without guarantees. I chose something knowing it would close other doors. Knowing it would make parts of my careful preparation useless. Knowing I would feel exposed, underqualified, unfinished. And I let that be true. The fear didn't disappear. It intensified. For the first time, I couldn't hide behind planning. I couldn't say this is temporary or I'll adjust later. I had stepped into something that would mark time forward instead of postponing it. I felt loss immediately. Loss of safety. Loss of optionality. Loss of the comforting belief that I could always change my mind without consequence. Preparation had been my armor. Living without it felt like standing unprotected in the open. There were days I panicked. Days I missed the old life, the one where nothing was fully at stake. Where I could always retreat into readiness. Where failure felt theoretical. Now, failure felt personal. But so did everything else. Time changed texture. Days stopped slipping past me unnoticed. Decisions mattered because they accumulated. I couldn't reset the narrative every morning. My choices had weight, and that weight pressed me into the present. I felt more pain. I also felt more reality. I began to understand something that preparation had hidden from me. Life doesn't reward readiness. It responds to presence. Presence doesn't feel safe. It doesn't wait for certainty. It doesn't ask if you've thought things through enough. It just asks whether you're here, fully, imperfectly, now. I looked back at the years I had spent preparing and felt a grief I couldn't soften. Not regret for specific choices. Regret for postponement. For all the moments I had told myself not yet until the feeling itself learned to fade. For all the chances that didn't fail, they expired. Quietly. Politely. Without leaving evidence that they had ever been possible. That grief didn't break me. It clarified me. I stopped asking whether I was ready and started asking a harder question. Am I willing to live with the cost of not choosing this? That question changed everything. Because there is a cost either way. Preparation costs time you never get back. Readiness costs presence. Waiting costs life itself. I didn't suddenly become fulfilled. I became committed. Committed to showing up even when I felt unprepared. Committed to allowing moments to matter even if they disrupted my plans. Committed to accepting that life would not feel controlled, and that control had never been the point. I still plan. But I don't hide inside it. I still think ahead. But I no longer live exclusively there. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, always preparing, always waiting, always telling yourself you'll start living once things are clearer, I won't tell you to rush. I'll tell you this. There is no future version of you that arrives fully ready. There is only the version that chooses, and the version that waits. And waiting feels safe right up until the moment you realize that life didn't pause while you were getting ready. I was always preparing for life. One day, I realized life had been happening without me. I can't reclaim the time I spent waiting. But I can refuse to spend what remains pretending that readiness is required. I'm not fully prepared. I'm finally present. And that, even now, even late, is the closest I've come to actually living.